Imagine being a South Korean police officer and your order for the day is to arrest your own president. That would be crazy. But it wouldn't be the first time in South Korea. You see, most presidents in this country either end up assassinated or imprisoned. But so far, throughout history, when a president got arrested, it was only after they had lost their powers. But now, for the first time ever, police were being ordered to arrest the president even though he was still the president. Something that was absolutely unimaginable up until this point. There are a lot of people still arguing whether it's even legal to be able to issue an arrest warrant for a president that's still the president. But it's too late for that now because the arrest warrant has been issued. And things had escalated beyond what anyone could have ever imagined. What led up to this? Well, it all started on December 3rd, when President Yoon announced martial law out of nowhere, making the country go into panic mode and having many civilians protest. Even though all the odds were against them, civilians helped the politicians go inside the National Assembly and vote to lift the martial law. They were the only ones who could stop it. Within the span of a few hours, martial law was over, but the country was absolutely shell-shocked. 10 days later, the president was impeached. But in South Korea, that's only the first step to get rid of a president. The second and final step is to have the Constitutional Court approve of him leaving. This would strip him of all powers and start a new election cycle. But unlike impeachment, that takes a while, like 2 to 3 months. Politicians wanted it to be done as fast as possible. But the acting president wasn't so much in a hurry, he was kind of stalling, so they impeached him too. South Korea is now on its third president in the span of a month, and he's been more cooperative, making sure to give the Constitutional Court every resource it needs to hurry up with its verdict. After that, new elections would start, and the impeached president would get arrested. And that's normally how things would have went, but not this time. This time, it was messier than usual. You see, back in 2020, during the previous administration, a new institution in government was founded, the CIO, otherwise known as the Corruption Investigation Office for High-Ranking Officials. Its main goal was to monitor over 6,500 different high-ranking officials in South Korea, as well as their family members, all to make sure that they avoid corruption or anything illegal. But their reputation has been down in the gutter these last few years because many critics say that they haven't really done much. So this was a massive opportunity. And they weren't just going to wait for the Constitutional Court, they wanted to take matters into their own hands. They wanted to personally question the president, but he kept ignoring them repeatedly, not taking them seriously. So they escalated it even further. On December 31st, they issued an arrest warrant for Yoon Suk-yeol, the president of South Korea. This was unprecedented, with Yoon's lawyers saying that this is an agency without investigative authority, and that to even think of issuing a warrant against a sitting president was illegal and invalid. But they did it anyway. After his very long silence, the president finally issued some sort of a statement 2 days after the arrest warrant, saying that he vows to fight until the end. He was barricaded in his presidential residence and hadn't left it since he was impeached. No one could have predicted what would happen next. With tensions being very high and one wrong move being able to cause complete and utter bloodshed, the stakes had never been higher. We are yet again witnessing history, so we have to talk about it. Let's do this. Alright, so in every video I make about South Korea, I always see people who are shocked that I'm their first source of information on the topic, with some wondering where I get my news. Well, I've been using the same app for 2 years now, and they decided to sponsor me after seeing my first South Korea video. They're called Ground News. They're an app and website that seek to make the news more transparent and accessible. Every day they collect thousands of articles and organize them by story. They then summarize the data for you, like with political bias. You can see the bias distribution for the story about South Korea on the right here, with 46% leaning on the left, 26% leaning on the center, and 28% leaning on the right. There's even a chart here that shows ownership, how many of these are independent or owned by private equity. You can also individually compare headlines, while also seeing the owner of the publication as well as their bias. And speaking of bias, there are certain news stories that some news publications refuse to talk about. That's where Ground News Blind Spot comes in. On the left, you'll see news stories that left-leaning publications aren't talking about enough, and on the other side, it'll be the same thing for right-leaning publications. This allows you to see the narrative each side is pushing without being caught off guard. So if you want to create an account to stay on top of non-biased news, then you can do so on ground.news/Mujin to get a 40% discount. Thank you so much to Ground News for sponsoring this video. Seeing that the president was not planning to leave his residence anytime soon, the police needed to go to him. But they couldn't take their sweet time. The arrest warrant was only valid for 7 days, so they had to get moving very quickly. But it wasn't so simple. One of the main issues is that geographically, this neighborhood is extremely sensitive. Regarded as the Beverly Hills of South Korea, Hanam-dong has some of the biggest celebrities living there, but it's also very politically significant. As you can see, some of the most important South Korean officials actually live here, and there are some very important foreign embassies next to them as well. Additionally, the presidential residence was on top of a hill and there was only one narrow road that could lead you there. It didn't take a genius to understand that if police were to show up, it would be barricaded. This is why many people thought that the police was just going to go there to try and intimidate the president, but that couldn't have been further from the truth. They showed up in massive numbers, but at the same time, there were many protesters supporting the president that showed up too. They were not expecting this at all. They had sent a few dozen officers but had to reinforce themselves with 100 more because of the sheer number of protesters. Even though it was very cold, they showed up to try to defend him, arguing that this was illegal. You can't just arrest a sitting president. But no matter how many challenges had presented themselves, they had 1 week for this arrest warrant and they were going to be sure to arrest him right here and now. Police was deployed to handle the protesters, while private investigators went through the barricades up the narrow road, hoping to reach the presidential residence with no issues. Imagine seeing this tiny army walk up the narrow path of your villa to come and arrest you. As they reached the gate, the presidential guard would not let them through, blocking them with their bodies. Look, this was the first time an arrest warrant was issued against the president. The presidential guard wasn't about to assault private investigators because they didn't want to be seen as the bad guys, and private investigators weren't going to assault the presidential guard because they didn't want to be seen as the bad guys either. So after a 5-hour standoff, they decided, you know what? We're not going to have any violence today. We're going to try again later. But the clock was ticking because the arrest warrant would expire after 7 days, and after that, they couldn't arrest him anymore. Supporters of the president saw this as a victory, while the people against him were furious. This was a failed operation, and it only made him look better. This was very bad news for the CIO. If they failed here, then other officials wouldn't take them seriously either. They weren't just going to back down. In fact, they did the opposite. They ended up extending the arrest warrant as it was about to expire and vowed to be way better prepared next time, because there was going to be a next time. In preparation for the second arrest attempt, thousands of South Koreans gathered in this very sensitive area to either show their support for the president or protest against him. But the CIO weren't the only ones preparing for this. The presidential guard was putting up barbed wires on the walls of the presidential residence. This had the full potential of going out of control and causing casualties. People were very nervous. It was only on January 14th that the second attempt to arrest President Yoon was going to take place, with many police showing up this time, way more than last time. There was also a bigger number of protesters. Many more things were happening that day, so here's a map that gives you an idea of the situation. You had pro-Yoon protesters right next to the path that led up to his residence, while anti-Yoon protesters had divided themselves on 2 roads. The presidential guard had fortified the narrow path up to the residence with 3 different blockades. And the police had to not only manage trying to get through these blockades to get to the president, but they also had to manage the pro-Yoon protesters because things were getting violent. This is footage showing an altercation between the police and pro-Yoon protesters when they found out that they were here to arrest him. It was getting very chaotic. There was yet again a huge number of police making it through the narrow path to the residence, but this time they weren't taking no for an answer. As they were going up this path, they had a few people hike the opposite end, which isn't a path. They climbed up the hill so that they could sneak behind the residence and cut through the barbed wire, This is crazy. Imagine this happening in another G7 country, like Japan, Australia, Canada, the United States. A government organization sneaking into the presidential residence? That's insane. And there it was happening. People feared that this was going to be yet another standoff with no real conclusion. It could have easily been the case, seeing that some people didn't even recognize the CIO's authority. But since things were getting violent and there were literal people trying to sneak into the presidential residence by cutting the barbed wire, the president finally broke his silence and on the next day in the morning had this to say. One of the president's lawyers said that if police were to withdraw, Yoon would appear in the court of the CIO voluntarily. Here's what he had to say. Recognizing that physical confrontations could lead to serious incidents, the president decided to appear despite knowing that the CIO's investigation and warrant are clearly unlawful. But even though he said that, the CIO reaffirmed, saying voluntary surrender is not being considered. The goal remains to execute the arrest warrant. So even though the president had given up, they still wanted to arrest him. He wasn't just going to show up by himself. And that's exactly what ended up happening. This is a picture of him in a police car. He was part of this convoy that led him to the CIO's detention facility. This was him leaving and going into the detention facility. He was then officially detained. For the first time in history, a serving president was detained. He was physically inspected, had a mugshot taken that wasn't leaked, and was put in a khaki uniform usually reserved for people who go on trial. He was being treated just like any other prisoner in this facility. The only special treatment he was given was that his cell had a TV. That's it. Otherwise, he was waking up at 6:30 a.m. and going to sleep at 9:30 p.m. just like everyone else. After arriving to the CIO, his team had released a video that he had taken back in the villa on the night before his arrest, with him reiterating the same points, that this investigation is illegal, that he's only doing this to avoid bloodshed, and that he will continue fighting until the end. I should mention that a lot of comments here are actually in support of him, saying that yes, this is illegal, it shouldn't be happening. This is not as one-sided as people might have thought it was. He was then questioned for hours, but wasn't very cooperative according to authorities. And regardless of whether he was sincere or not about not wanting violence, while he was being questioned, his supporters had damaged the court he was in, the CIO. They had destroyed windows, causing numerous property damages, and many got in trouble with the police. The sitting president then attended his first impeachment hearing to defend his martial law decision. And even though he was questioned on numerous topics, his answers stayed very short and straight to the point. One of the biggest accusations against him was that during martial law, he had told the commander of the Capital Defense Command and the commander of the Special Warfare Command to drag out parliament members out of the National Assembly as they were trying to lift the martial law declaration, with both of these people testifying that he ordered them that. When he was asked whether he did during the hearing, he just said, no. That's all he said. Just no. It's obvious that he couldn't care less because the impeachment trial is at the bottom list of his priorities right now. On the 27th of January, he was officially charged with insurrection, accelerated by the CIO's involvement. If found guilty, the punishment for insurrection is either life in prison or death. The impeachment's almost guaranteed to go through during the first week of February, and after it does, it seems that Yoon Suk-yeol will probably, like many others before him, spend the rest of his life in prison. But here's the thing. Opinion polls in South Korea have been showing that in the last month, Yoon Suk-yeol's approval rating has almost doubled, being in the 10 to 20% range after the failed martial law attempt to now being almost 42%. This article, though, alleges that some of these polls have very biased or misleading questions, saying that there's currently an ideological war in South Korea. And honestly, it doesn't really take a genius to understand that things are very complicated right now. I wish the South Korean people the best outcome there is, but in the end, hindsight is going to be 20/20. Who's actually right and who's actually in the wrong? Time will eventually reveal that. For now, though, stay safe. Thank you so much for watching until the end. I really appreciate that, and I'll see you in the next video, whenever that is. I love you. Mwah.